Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you, Marissa. Hope everyone had a nice break. I really enjoyed the music that was playing, although the Star Wars soundtrack might have given more of an ominous tone to our next presentation, but I promise this won't be scary. So yeah, we're really excited to be here and to present with you all and have this interactive session. We know it is right after lunch, so might be in the kind of post-lunch slump, but hopefully this interactive session will help re-energize folks and would love to be in person with you all, of course, to like get you up and moving, but at least we'll be able to break you out into virtual rooms and give you a chance to work with your teams. So we are going to be talking about building a commercialization plan. So this is a critical document, critical component that a lot of early stage innovators should be thinking about. And we're excited to be able to share some really tangible guidance on how to build a commercialization plan, as well as allow you to have some access to some experts that have a lot of experience with this. So Brailey and I will be the main presenters today. Looking at all of the attendees on the Zoom screen, it's nice to see a lot of investigators that we've had a chance to work with through various capacities through the Catalyze Coordinating Center. And also great to see some new investigators and those that we haven't had a chance to work with. So we're excited to be here with you today. Like I mentioned, we do have a couple of our colleagues, Ben and Wout, are going to be joining as well. In their past life before RTI, they worked to help early stage innovators and entrepreneurs get SBIR and SCTR funding. So they helped with application preparation. And so they are very much posed to understand what constitutes a good commercialization plan. So we'll have some time for you to interact with them and ask maybe more even granular questions to them. Mentioned before the lunch break, kind of the run of show here, but I'll give a little bit more of a granular overview. So Brailey and I are going to be we'll try to be quick with our presentation. We want to maximize the time that you have with the experts and with your team. So we're going to try to cover the components of a commercialization plan and some guidance there in 20 minutes. We'll then try to leave 10 minutes for a question and answer in this main room with your experts that I just mentioned, so Ben and Wout. And then we will transition to an activity with your team. As Mike Peck mentioned earlier, we are going to have around 50 breakout rooms. You already got familiarity with jumping to breakout rooms in the previous sessions. That was kind of your trial run. So now it's kind of the big leagues. You'll have to find your investigator breakout room and do an activity where you're going to actually get to start to think about some components of your commercialization plan. But Brailey will give more information on that as we get to that portion of the hour. I will say too, as we go through this presentation, if you have any questions, I know we have a dedicated time for question and answer, but please go ahead and feel free to pop questions into the chat as they pop into your brain. Wout and Ben will be monitoring the chat and might be able to answer via chat. But if they think it's more complicated too, they might save it for the question and answer portion, but just want to allow you to have that kind of running log of questions. Okay, so I know this session is called Building a Commercialization Plan. And so we are going to get kind of tactical. We are going to go through the kind of main components of a commercialization plan. And as I mentioned, give you some guidance on how to develop a commercialization plan. But I wanted to take a step back and start at the beginning to say what a commercialization plan is. I know we might have folks that have varying experience with commercialization plans, and also they can take a lot of different forms. So really, when we think of what a commercialization plan is, simply it's a guidance document that collates and outlines an innovator or entrepreneur's team's plan for their path to market, their kind of preferred path to market. So this document should be able to provide guidance for what that commercialization path is, but it's not one that you just do once and put on a shelf and say, this is it, this is the path to market. We know that obviously market dynamics can change as well as regulatory guidance. And so this document is meant to be iterative and agile as things do shift and as your team's resources shift as well. And so, as I mentioned, I know there's probably varying experience with commercialization plan on the phone. I know that a lot of you, a lot of our preclinical investigators had to complete a preclinical or a commercialization plan for your preclinical application, as well as many of you might be familiar that it is a necessary component for some non-dilutive grant applications like phase 2 SBIR, STTR. But there's a lot of other values that can entrepreneurs and investigators can get from developing a commercialization plan early in development. It might be a requirement or an expectation for investments or investors or other dilutive funding as they're kind of doing their due diligence. They might want to see that you have a formalized plan. In addition, it is a good way to make sure that your team, your core investigator and innovator team is aligned on your preferred path to market, right? And that you all are on the same page about your exit strategy is, for example. Lastly, it is a great way as well to understand where you might have gaps or unknowns or potential questions that you might need to address as a team before you proceed to your next milestone. So beyond being kind of a required, component of certain applications, there's other values that developing a commercialization plan can provide to your team. We've talked about the fact that commercialization plans can take a lot of different forms, right, and have a lot of different purposes. But if we think of maybe the MVP, the minimally viable product of a commercialization plan, they typically have these 7 components within them, especially as we think for our kind of vein of therapies, drugs, diagnostics. And so in the rest of this presentation, we are going to be going through each of these sections and giving you, again, kind of tangible information on what should be included in these sections of a commercialization plan, as well as some tips and tricks. Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, there is going to be a similar format that you'll see with the slides. So each of the sections that we just had on the slide, we'll be covering this information for each of those sections. So we'll have your key questions to answer, best practices, and then recommended length. Again, we've mentioned there's different purposes for commercialization plans. So the length is just a recommendation to show you kind of what's most important and what should be given the most screen time, I guess you could say, in terms of your commercialization plan. So we're going to start with the value, expected outcomes, and impact section. And it's actually a good place to start because we really consider this to be kind of your elevator pitch for your commercialization plan. It really should focus on the unmet need that your technology or your approach is solving. It should give an introduction to your technology and then your potential benefits that you think your technology will provide if it's brought to the market. Again, this is an elevator pitch, so one kind of best practice here is to balance the technical detail that you provide in this section. You want to make sure that you're providing enough technical detail to kind of build credibility, kind of justify your approach, but not getting too much in the weeds. The commercialization plan in general should have a far different tone than, say, a research plan or when you're talking about your technical milestones. In addition, in this section, you do want to make sure that you can provide any data or kind of backing up of the unmet needs. So if you can provide any maybe pain points or challenges that patients experience with current standards of care, as well as maybe even the economic burden of patients and their needs not being fully addressed. So having that kind of discrete data can help with this section. In addition, this is an elevator pitch, so you do want to keep it kind of tight. It should be around 1 to 2 pages. Next, we have the company overview section. So in the same vein of this, of the value expected outcomes being kind of a pitch for your approach for your technology, this section should almost be a pitch for your company and your team. So you should really want to highlight and need to highlight who your team is, the expertise and background, and why your team, above all other teams, is set up to succeed in this specific market for your specific education or indication, rather. Kind of tips and tricks to keep in mind here is be sure that, obviously when teams and innovator teams first form, you have a lot of technical expertise normally because you need to understand how to develop the technology, the device, and get that proof of concept. We will say that equally as important is that commercialization, that business, that market expertise, if you have it on your team. So be sure to highlight, even if it's not with this project, if you have team members that have past experience, highlight their past kind of forays into commercialization and launching new disruptive technologies. You can also include your boards and including your business advisory board or your scientific advisory board too. It doesn't just have to be your core team. In addition to, and I think this is a common theme across all of these sections, if you have gaps on your team, you know that you need to hire a regulatory consultant, let's say, or you really want a business development person on your team, but you don't have the resources yet to hire them, that's okay. As long as you can say, we know this is a gap, we know that we need to hire for this in the future, that's what reviewers or investors are looking for, right? They know that you're not going to have everything addressed as a small company or an early investigator team. in these initial stages. But if you have the gap identified and know you and have a path forward to address that gap, that's going to speak volumes. So again, this section should be about 1 to 2 pages. We see sometimes that investigator teams tend to maybe keep this section shorter and not include all the expertise of their team. So make sure you take the space and really show how your team's going to be set up for success in your environment. The next section is probably the meatiest part of the commercialization plan. So this section includes your market, your customer, and your competition. So we did have to break this up into multiple slides because it is, again, the longest section typically in the commercialization plan. So if we start with market, that's really about kind of demonstrating the economic opportunity for your technology. Typically, people will address this through market sizing. So graphic on the right, you see that's a kind of a market sizing graphic where we have your TAM, or your total addressable market. So that you could think of this as your entire patient population multiplied by your expected revenue, right? You move down a segment into your SAM, or your serviceable addressable market. So that might be the first segment of the patient population that you're going to target, right? You're not likely going to be able to address the entire population when you start. But there might be a segment that doesn't respond as well to current standards of treatment, or that you expect might respond very nicely to your treatment. So that could represent your SAM. And then finally, your SOM, or your serviceable obtainable market, which is in the first few years, the portion that you can reasonably capture given your resources and your capabilities as a team. Not going to spend a lot of time going through how to market size, but we actually do have a webinar that Brailey and I gave back in April that is on the Catalyze website and also on YouTube. So if you do want to check that out, that does go into a lot of detail on how to size the market, and then we're always available for questions too. But really in this section, what I would focus on is having some initial estimates of what that market opportunity is, and be sure to include any of the assumptions that you use to create your market size, as well as any other trends or drivers that will help demonstrate to investors or reviewers that you have a really good grasp on the market dynamics and how it's going to continue to shift and change. The customer section does build upon your market section. You can kind of think of it as an expansion of your SAM almost, at serviceable addressable market. Here you want to really highlight who are your customers, expected customers, and what needs are you solving for them. You want to be able to think about maybe some nuances with your customers and how those might differ from your end user. So if you think about if you're developing a technology that physicians will use in a hospital, right? Your physicians might be your end user, but your customer might be the administration at the hospital, right? So you might have to have different approaches to win those different kind of segments over. I think a big piece of advice here is that if you have any anecdotes, quotes, insights, or ideally letters of support from experts in the field or your customers, this is a great place for those for that information to be included. Talking to your customers, understanding more of the need, validating that your approach could solve some of those needs, and getting information about, considerations for adoption, as well as getting buy-in from experts, can speak volumes and really justify your approach to reviewers or to investors. And then finally, to wrap up this section, the competition portion of it. So the competition portion is really reviewers and investors and others that'll be looking at your commercialization plan are wanting to make sure that you understand what market are you entering into? What does that environment look like? And are you aware of the current standard of care in emerging therapies or treatments? And how does your approach compare? So I think the two biggest pieces of advice here for the competition section is that you'll always have competition. Even if there is not a treatment available, there still needs to be a behavior change from patients and physicians not doing anything at the moment to adopting your new approach. So regardless, there always will be competition for you to compare your therapy or your treatment or device against, as well as make sure that your competitive advantages that you're highlighting in this section are true competitive advantages. Make sure that they're not easy to replicate and that they are differentiators between your approach and others. Often, graphics are great to include in your commercialization plan. And so a lot of times we'll see teams put together a table that's really simple that has kind of your technology, competitor technologies, and how they compare amongst different competitive advantages. So often that'll help reviewers kind of grasp at a quick glance, oh, this is how your technology ranks and is ideally better than those that are on the market or being developed. So again, this section is the biggest section of the plan and should be around kind of 4 pages. Got a lot more sections to cover, and I'm going to pass it over to Brailey to hit the next one, which I think is the 4 Ps.
Yes, the 4 Ps. Awesome. Thank you, Emily. So the 4 Ps we're referencing as a part of the production and marketing plan. And although it sounds like a lot of information that I'll be covering on this slide, typically this is only about a half a page to a page worth of the commercialization plan. But really the purpose of this section is describing how your product or your technology will scale up and successfully reach the market. So the 4 Ps, product, place, promotion, and pricing, is what we're going to be covering very quickly here. When we say product, we're really talking about the cost and the strategy to manufacture the technology. So important pieces to highlight as a part of this include really the who and the where related to manufacturing. So considering how you're going to manufacture the technology, what will be done in-house versus what will be outsourced to a CRO or a CDMO partner, and how those needs will change with, for example, CGMP requirements and scale up. Also considering, what is the actual cost to manufacture these goods and how will that compare to the price point that we would like to sell this technology for? And finally, highlighting any risks related to the manufacturing strategy and how you could put different plans in place to overcome those risks in the future. With place, it's about highlighting, how is your product going to get to where it needs to be in order for that end user to actually adopt it. So this is really thinking about the channels that might be needed for distribution and management, or any policies and procedures that might need to be developed. With promotion, you'll want to highlight how you plan to communicate with potential end users and customers, and ultimately how you're going to market the product to drive sales. And finally, with pricing, you'll want to highlight the value that the product is going to bring to customers and users, and the price that you're actually going to sell the technology for example. The biggest piece of advice with this section is highlighting and identifying your exit strategy first and foremost, but also which activities your company will be taking on and building out that expertise in-house, and which activities you would prefer partners, licensees, or acquirers to actually take over and manage in the future so that you do not have to build it out in-house on your own. And Emily, I think you can jump to the next slide. Wonderful. So the intellectual property section is typically about a half a page. And this section is really highlighting how the company and the team is protecting any IP that is going to enable the successful commercialization of the product and help to protect against competitors and other similar solutions to being developed. So when we're thinking about IP, we're talking about, patents, copyrights, trade secrets, trademarks, and any other forms of protection that are most appropriate for what your product needs in order to be, again, protected. So for this section, you'll want to highlight IP that is currently in place and its status, as well as plans and strategies for expected new sources of IP in the future. As a part of this, it will be important to highlight whether any of this IP is shared with collaborators. So for example, if you're a university spinoff, highlighting if the university filed for IP and if you have licensed that IP already, or if not, what your plans are to license it from the university in the future. It will be important to include mention of any legal counsel that you are working with now, or if you don't have the funds to have that right now, plans to engage with IP counsel in the future. It's also important to highlight any international jurisdictions outside of the US that you either currently have or plan to apply for protection in, with a brief explanation as to, why you chose those specific countries. I think the biggest piece of advice for this section is, if you have an extensive IP portfolio, you could always build a table that just gives a quick overview, including, the title or the name of the patent, the numbers, the jurisdictions which they've been filed in, and the status of the application. And then again, leaning into any IP expertise and legal counsel that you have in-house or you have engaged with to date. The regulatory section is the next section. I think this might be a bit more straightforward, but it's typically about a half a page to a page. And again, really is outlining the regulatory pathway that you expect to take, any regulatory support you have in place or plan to engage with in the future, and any regulatory advantages that you might be eligible for with your product. So again, in this section, you'll want to highlight the intended regulatory pathway you'll pursue, any regulatory advantages your approach has, and if you're eligible for example, breakthrough or orphan drug designation. It will also be important to include any plans for preclinical and clinical studies and any collaborators that you have in place or will need to engage with in the future in order to complete those studies. Any regulatory support that you, again, already have in place, or if you don't have that yet, plans to fill that gap in the future. Again, just pointing out that we are aware that this is a gap, but we do have plans to bring in X, Y, and Z expertise in the future. And finally, highlighting if you've engaged with the FDA to date and any feedback that you've received. And if you haven't engaged with the FDA yet, that's not a problem. Just highlighting, expected timelines for engagement to meet with the FDA, as well as when you intend to submit different FDA packages and when you plan to initiate clinical trials, if that's applicable to your product or technology. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So the finance plan section is about 1 page, and this is a really critical piece of the commercialization plan because it's really outlining, what is coming in the future and what do we need in order to be successful with those future milestones. So in this section, you'll want to outline the milestones that are needed in order to reach the desired exit point that your company would like to get to, the activities needed to reach and complete each of those milestones, and then the required funding in order to complete each of those activities. One really simple way to do this in a way that's not too wordy is developing a Gantt chart or some sort of chart like on the right side of the screen here that outlines, again, those activities, how long they are going to last, what milestones those activities are going to get you to, and the funding that you foresee being needed for each of those. As a part of this section, you'll also want to highlight what types of funding you have received to date and where you plan to go in the future to receive additional funding. For example, those could be dilutive sources, non-dilutive sources, angel investors, venture capitalists, or any planned fundraising rounds and for what amount that you are looking towards in the future, and any partnerships that could provide funding opportunities. One of the biggest pieces of advice here is if you have any letters of support, intent, or commitments related to future funding already in place, whether it's from investors or other types of funding sources or partnerships, it's really beneficial to include those as a part of the application for this section because it helps to show to whoever you've developed this commercialization plan for that there will be continued support financially for this product in the future to get it to the market successfully. And to round out the commercialization plan, the final piece is the revenue section. And this is really only about a half a page, but really helps to outline how your team plans to make money from selling the product or the technology. So in this section, you'll want to highlight any strategies that you've thought about in order to generate revenue, as well as a reimbursement strategy if that's applicable, again, to your product or your technology. You'll also want to highlight any associated costs with developing and selling or marketing the technology and expected profits. And you might also consider developing and including a 5-year financial projection, Now, it's important to note with that financial projection, you don't necessarily need to be in revenue during those 3 to 5 years, but it will be important to show when your team expects to actually start making that revenue. And again, this is a very short section. Everyone understands that this is a bit forward-looking, but it's important to at least show and highlight that you've put some thought into this strategy and what your expectations are. Now, we know that a commercialization plan, if you haven't thought too much about this, could be overwhelming, or if you have started to develop a commercialization plan, there are still quite a few resources available to help you, whether it's with the actual development piece or with reviewing what you've developed to date. We recommend first engaging with us, the Catalyze Coordinating Center. If this is something that you would like help with, we have a variety of resources and experts that can help your teams either prepare for and gather information needed for different sections of the document, but we can also provide reviews and feedback as you are actually starting to develop that document. Your NHLBI PO could be beneficial in connecting you to additional resources and experts. And if you're applying to Phase 2 SBIR, STTR funding, you could also consider having a conversation to understand, what activities and milestones should be included as a part of that application more broadly. And finally, NHLBI entrepreneurs and residents might also be available to help review your commercialization plan as well. So there are quite a few available resources, both within the Coordinating Center and the NHLBI. And in addition to that, Emily and I will be sharing guidance documents and templates in the following days through most likely Marissa, which will provide additional information, some of the resources we use to develop this presentation that really leans into and gives more information on how to think about and develop each component of this document. So those will be coming in the following days.
Okay. So Brailey, let's maybe transition to question and answer.
Yes.
With our experts, Ben and Wout. We have about maybe 5 minutes. We might be able to squeeze a 6 or 7 if we have a lot of questions. But Patrick, if you could pin Ben and Wout, and then if folks could raise hands or pop questions into the chat, would love to hear what questions you have. I know we had to go through that fairly quickly, but you also have time to do some activities with your teams as well.